Is this really a coup to get rid of the Prime Minister?
The whole thing is literally mad.
The Health Secretary has been at the centre of the rumours, forced to say on the record that he's not trying to take the top job. He promises he's a loyal and faithful Cabinet Minister.
I think this is probably about the most unjustified attack on a faithful since Joe Marler was banished in the final of Celebrity Traitors.
Having denials from members of the Cabinet that they're trying to unseat a Prime Minister, that's a pretty unusual event. I do believe Wes Streeting.
Yeah.
Frankly, if he doesn't do the day job, fixing the health service well, he's never going to be a candidate to run a sweet shop, let alone the government.
It all started out of the blue on Tuesday night when Downing Street was forced to address it, saying Starmer would fight any leadership challenge. So how much trouble is the Prime Minister really in? Hello and welcome to Talking Politics. I'm Tom Bradby.
And I'm Robert Peston, and we're going to struggle to find anything of interest to talk about today, I suspect.
Well, indeed we are. But before we get going, we're going to talk about the crazy last 24 hours in Downing Street first, and then obviously the BBC and all the crazy stuff going on there second, and no doubt the two conversations will merge together. But first, let's hear what the Health Secretary Wes Streeting had to say on his, what should have been a routine morning media round today, and certainly wasn't.
Very straightforward question. Are you plotting against the Prime Minister?
I can tell you this morning that the mad claims made overnight by Downing Street sources are categorically untrue. I think this is probably about the most unjustified attack on a faithful since Joe Marler was banished in the final of Celebrity Traitors, and clearly someone in Downing Street has been watching far too much of that programme and should probably spend a bit more time watching Country File.
Why are they plotting against you then, if it's not true?
Look, I have no idea where these briefings in Downing Street have come from.
You must know who's doing this. Who is briefing against you?
If I knew, the Prime Minister would fire them. Look, I don't think these sorts of briefings are at all helpful to the Prime Minister. He's not fighting to save his own job. He is fighting to turn the country around. And what we've seen from Downing Street overnight are a series of categorically untrue briefings.
Do you have ambitions to be Prime Minister?
I will not be challenging the Prime Minister at the budget or at any other time.
So you do have ambitions to be Prime Minister?
I'm not giving this story any more legs or any more news lines. I think it is silly Westminster bubble nonsense.
Well, that was Wes Streeting. I think we all enjoyed the Country File line. But let's hear what Kemi Badenoch had to say to Keir Starmer at Prime Minister's questions.
This morning on the BBC, the Health Secretary said there is a toxic culture in Downing Street that needs to change. He's right, isn't he?
Mr. Speaker, my focus each and every day is on rebuilding and renewing our country. But let me be absolutely clear, any attack on any member of my cabinet is completely unacceptable.
What's gone on? What's actually happened?
God, where to start? Look, there are some fundamentals, and the fundamentals are incredibly unpopular Prime Minister. I mean, literally by historical standards, in terms of his poll ratings, unbelievably unpopular Prime Minister. Labour Party plummeting in the polls now, in a number of polls less popular than the Green Party. So the backdrop is very anxious MPs. Obviously, the general election is 3.5 years away, but anxious that this is going to be rather a short-term job for many of them. But actually, until the briefings from Downing Street started last night, I didn't think there was likely to be an attempted coup against the Prime Minister until, after May, if the May local and national elections are terrible for Labour, then there obviously is a risk that Labour MPs will want to get rid of him. But I assume we were on a relatively slow burn to a potential disaster for him. And then last night, we get these briefings out of Downing Street that if there's a challenge and, if it were to come after what obviously everybody thinks is going to be a pretty controversial and potentially unpopular budget, that if there's a challenge to him then, Keir Starmer will stay and fight, that he won't give up easily, he won't walk away quietly, that he will essentially try and use all devices to try and stay in office. And more than that, they also said, by the way, in essence, they're saying those people who are thinking of challenging him are being desperately unpatriotic because, Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves believe that if they're forced out, UK government bond prices will collapse, which means that effectively the interest rate that the government pays will soar, the interest rates that we pay.
Is there any truth?
We need to come back. We need to come back to all of this. I just want to take you through the narrative, and then we can unpack it. And therefore, they would essentially be damaging the UK by doing this plotting. And by the way, they did identify Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, as the main plotter. And the moment that my jaw dropped yesterday evening was when I rang Streeting and his people, and his official spokesperson gave me because normally in these circumstances, you've done this job, people don't really like going on the record. They just say, well, it's not true, and it's all sort of background. But the moment I thought, wow, this is a big story, and the reason we ended up, the reason I led News at 10 last night with this story was because of this, really remarkable thing that, we actually had the Health Secretary on the record denying that he's plotting to unseat the Prime Minister. We then had him again out this morning, because these, having denials from members of the cabinet that they're trying to unseat a Prime Minister, that's a pretty unusual event. And it's sort of incredible event for, a government that's been in office for, about 15 months now, something like that, and has this enormous majority. Right? In normal circumstances, the idea that a Prime Minister would be vulnerable, it's just the whole thing is literally mad, but it does point to something real and something genuinely that should worry the Prime Minister, which is he's got a bunch of incredibly unhappy MPs and also very unhappy people who work for him. This self-harming, in these series of self-harming internal attacks just point to the fact that a government that should be the most stable, probably since 1997, which was the last time we saw a majority of this scale, is about as unstable a government as any of us can remember. And that is such I'm afraid it is an indictment of how he's run this government.
Do you think it's right to say there was a coup in the offing?
No, I don't, if I'm completely honest with you. I think it's right to say, as I started, my rather long exposition, I think it's right to say that there could well be a coup if the May elections are a catastrophe. And I guess, theoretically, if the budget is an utter disaster for the government, then you could, I suppose, see circumstances where all of a sudden, MPs decide they've had enough. But we're not at that. We're genuinely not at that moment. And no, I don't believe that. I'm sure Wes Streeting would want to be Prime Minister one day. He's a very ambitious politician. I don't believe this is a sort of. You'll remember the Michael Portillo moment where, during the John Major premiership, he secretly hired a room and filled it with telephones, and that was a real plot. Right? He was found out, and it all sort of rather evaporated in embarrassing circumstances. But that was a real plot, right? I don't think do I think that whether it's Wes Streeting or Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, also very ambitious. The former Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, who will be trying to work out how she comes back into frontline politics. And, despite... I still think will be an important candidate for the leadership as and when the I think they all will have conversations with their close friends about what they do when the moment arises, as of course Andy Burnham. We know Andy Burnham does, right? The Mayor of Greater Manchester. But that is a world away, right? That is a world away from plotting to create a moment soon where you topple. I don't know. I mean, I'm afraid I believe Wes Streeting. Well, do I need to say I'm afraid? But I do believe Wes Streeting when he says, he is focused on trying to do the day job reasonably well. Because frankly, if he doesn't do the day job, fixing the health service well, he's never going to be a candidate to run a sweet shop, let alone the government. And so, and I'm sure he's rational enough to know that that is what he should be concentrating on and is concentrating on.
I mean, I think it's just what I feel about this, having kind of watched it over the last 24 hours, is sort of, I just keep asking myself how we got to this point where politics is madness everywhere. I don't feel politics in the UK should be that complicated at the moment. Every time I have a conversation with anyone outside the Westminster bubble, they basically say the same thing. They just want the government to get on with solving the problems. They want the public services to work. They want illegal immigration to be properly dealt with. They'd like a government that felt like it was actually operational, services that felt like they were operational, and the idea that things were getting better. Yeah, sure, they'd probably like to not be paying as much tax and pay less tax if possible. Nobody ever wants to pay more taxes, but I think it's going to be extraordinarily difficult, as we've said many times before, for Rachel Reeves to come back, as we think she's going to break her election promise and really substantially put up taxes, particularly with the economy limping along. I think we're all agreed that's going to be very difficult. Do I think it's completely impossible that the public might accept it? No, I think the public might, if the government kept its head down, did the job, it's conceivable that they might accept it. Not likely, but conceivable. As we keep saying, we're miles from the next election. They've got a massive majority. And, when we come on to talk about the BBC, I think we should address this constant feeling you have about this government, that it's in office but not in power. They don't wield power. And sometimes it's just in the most, regardless of the rights or wrongs of it, in the most bizarre way. And
so let's just...
But let me just finish my point. I think do you remember, I can't even remember which election it was. Was it Theresa May's election or Boris Johnson's, where Brenda from Bristol said, "Oh no, not again," and it sort of captured the mood of the country. The idea that the public... I mean, I hold no candle for Keir Starmer, and I'm not making any commentary on he's a good, bad, indifferent or terrible leader. The fact of the matter is, he's their damn leader. They chose him. They've got to get their together, if you'll excuse my terminology, under that leader. If they think changing the leader is going to improve their standing with the country, I'd say they're insane, personally. That's my feeling about it. I think the public will go, oh, we had that with the last lot. The idea that you're going to try it as well. I mean, honestly, you're a bunch of jokers. Forget it.
Yeah, I mean, so I don't... Look, I think there's an enormous amount of unhappiness in the Parliamentary Labour Party and Labour MPs about what they see as the succession of mistakes that this government has made, and the lack of... it's a word that Keir Starmer himself personally hates, but it's one that is, it's just part of, absolutely basic politics. They regret what they see as a lack of vision or a story about where Keir Starmer wants to take the country. And as I say, I do think if things are not turned round by the time of the May election, I do think he's in real trouble, right? But the other, I think, serious weakness, flaw in this government, in his government, is he is surrounded by officials whose way of life for years has been fighting factions within the Labour Party, led by Morgan McSweeney, his chief of staff, whose mindset over many years was, fight the Corbynistas, fight those who were sort of in his view, damaging the ability of the Labour Party to move back to the centre and be electable again. And I think that mindset of seeing enemies all around you has infected this government from the start. I mean, as you remember, at various different times, they expelled Labour MPs for rebelling against them in particular votes to a degree that we've never seen before with a Labour government. Tony Blair, in a sense, tolerated way worse rebellions and way more severe personal criticism than Starmer and his team seem to be able to cope with. Now, they have slightly changed their tack. Many of those expelled Labour MPs are now back in the parliamentary party. But what yesterday was a symptom of was just a mindset where they see enemies and they obviously get energised by fighting these enemies. Now, as I say, look, there is a sort of truth in singling out Wes Streeting in that he's a very ambitious politician. But it also, as I say, I just honestly thought it was comic last night when I.
It was absurd.
Yeah, because it goes. I mean, there's another. I mean, depending on, as I say, on your point of view, this is either a comedy or a tragedy. But there's another absolutely,
or both,
mad aspect of all of this. Right. One of the things I revealed last night is that 2 weeks ago, Downing Street invited a woman called Kitty Usher, who you may remember. She was a Labour minister. She had been a Labour advisor. And then she left government. And these days, she's quite a senior director at Barclays. And she was invited into Downing Street to address basically every special advisor. And what she was asked to talk about is why UK government bond prices, gilt prices, are sort of low compared to our international competitors. And the way you measure essentially whether they're high or low is on the basis of the so-called yield, and the yield is the interest rate that the government effectively has to pay, right? And the higher the interest rate, the more risky investors think that lending to a government is. And the sort of one of the most damaging things about or one of the most embarrassing things and painful things for the British government is that the interest rate it pays to borrow is significantly higher than every single one of our major competitors, including France, which is an ungovernable country, right? So this government pays more to borrow, significantly more to borrow than France does. Now, there are some technical reasons for that, but nonetheless, it is embarrassing for the British government that it has to pay more than these other countries. And it also has a real economic effect because, the government is paying out more than 100 billion a year in interest. And that is 100 billion pounds that is way more than, it's like double the school's budget. It's roughly double the defence budget. If we didn't have to pay that interest, think how much better public services would be. So it's painful. And what Kitty Usher said was the reason why the British government was paying so much more is because there was a perception that the Labour government was divided, that it was difficult to push through, for example, things like welfare reforms because they'd been rejected by Labour MPs, and that the perception that possibly Keir Starmer and the Chancellor Rachel Reeves would be kicked out was regarded by investors as deeply troubling because they feared that if they were kicked out, they would be replaced by people who would not have the same commitment as Rachel Reeves and the Prime Minister to managing the debt, managing the borrowing and getting it under control, right? And so she's saying, you have to be united. You mustn't brief against the Prime Minister, because if you brief against the Prime Minister, actually, there will be a fiscal crisis because interest rates will rise even more and will be effectively in a kind of Liz Truss kind of disastrous situation, right? So that's what she said.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the special advisors heard all of this and, actually, I don't think there had been since then any particular briefings against the Prime Minister or the Chancellor, certainly not from those sources. So imagine my surprise when last night the individuals who are briefing that the Prime Minister and Chancellor are faced with a coup are broadly the Prime Minister's and Chancellor's own allies. They are the people who are telling the creditors of the UK these people are not safe, which is insane. And as I said on the news at 10 last night, I was absolutely certain that this would lead gilt prices to fall and the interest rate that the government pays to rise. And lo and behold, this morning, that is what happened. And it's even more embarrassing that it's happened because overnight in America, right, investors became more confident. Actually, US government debt prices rose. Normally, when US government debt prices rise, they pull up the price of the debt of other countries. But our debt fell. And it shows you why this political instability is genuinely, it's not just damaging to the reputation of the government, it's damaging to the economy.
We should be realistic about this. There's always coup plotting, isn't there? I mean, we can't rewrite the history of Blair Brown. I mean, that was one long coup plot, arguably, and at the end of Brown, James Purnell resigned. We all thought David Miliband was going to walk out. Endless talk of kind of getting rid of Brown. The Tories coup plot about every third month, third week, whichever you want to say. I mean, it always goes on. I suppose I just think the country's, Blair was presiding over a booming economy. He was totally dominant. It was easy to kind of brush those off.
Well, hang on a second. We should just remind people, be absolutely clear. There was a completely different instability in the Blair Brown years, which is Gordon Brown. Gordon Brown always thought that he had an understanding with Tony Blair that he would take over at a certain point, and there was enormous amounts of tension about when, about how binding that agreement was and when he would take over. But the reality is that Blair was, Brown nonetheless towed a sort of line in not pushing it until a number of years had passed, and it was just way more stable. Even though you could argue, in fact, I would argue that Blair pushed through way more painful changes to the Labour Party than Starmer has attempted. Even though a lot of what Starmer has done.
All I was going to really go on to say, I think, is that I feel like both sides in this are really, I speak. Like you, I've heard Labour MPs moaning fairly consistently about the leadership and how ineffective they think it is. That said, both of us went and listened to his speech at the Labour Party conference, and we sat here on this podcast saying actually we thought it was pretty good, and he had kind of managed to set out a bit of a vision for what the kind of leadership that he believed in.
But he is obviously also unbelievably thick-skinned, because I can't imagine a sort of worse 12, 24 hours for a Prime Minister. Actually, he was pretty robust today.
Yeah.
He didn't look cowed, which was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose all I'm saying really is that I feel like both sides are equally to blame with this. There are some kind of people saying crazy things, and there are people in Downing Street doing stupid things. And I think the country is thinking almost to the last man and woman, will you all just, excuse my language, grow up and get on with it. It's just get on with it.
This is terrible for the government.
This country is in a hole. We want you to get on with it. Stop all this nonsense. We've had that for the last X many years with the other lot. We just really want you to shut up and get on with it. But I wanted to make one more point, because it leads us into our other subject of discussion, the BBC. Not to bang on about like communication strategy and everything else, but there just seems to be one of them weirdest kind of attitudes that I can't really understand, is this business of being in office but not being in power. Now, listen, we should make a full disclosure here. Deborah Turness, the outgoing chief executive of BBC News, is a very close personal friend of mine. I've known her for decades. She was my boss all the time I was political editor here, which was a decade. She was my boss, and we spoke 3, 4, 5 times a day, made many difficult decisions together. And all that. I mean, I know beyond any doubt that she's a woman of incredible talent and great integrity. So I think her loss to BBC News is a tragedy. And, what I would say about the whole kind of, business is, I've spent a lot of time talking to newspaper editors, even over the last year, and a lot of right-wing newspaper editors about the BBC. And to put again on the record, I think they do have an understandable beef against the BBC, which goes on and to which there is no easy answer, which is that they think the fact that the BBC does everything everywhere distorts the commercial market and makes life more difficult for their websites and so on. And I think there's almost certainly some truth in that. Commercial radio has long sensed that BBC local radio is very problematic in that regard. And one could go on and on about that. And these are real concerns. But I find the idea that the BBC is the BBC makes mistakes. It made a mistake with the Trump edit, though we should perhaps talk about the documentary as well in a moment. But like the idea that it's institutionally biased, I mean, which damn way? Like the left say it's, biased to the right and they're constantly giving reform too much airtime, and the right say it's institutionally biased. I mean, it's got lots of problems, but the idea that it's institutionally biased just seems kind of absurd to me. But I and so we can debate the rights and wrongs of what happened. But I just think, and on the question of the board and Robbie Gibb and, the other right-wing members of the board, it just seems to me beyond argument that there shouldn't be political appointees on the board per se. Why can't you have a board where you have, I don't know, you put David Dimbleby in his chair and you concentrate on people and having people who have spent their career in broadcasting, committed to impartiality or are otherwise neutral. I don't really understand that. But the most extraordinary thing almost of all in a political sense is we've got a left-wing government with a massive majority overseeing an alleged right-wing coup within the BBC. We'll debate whether that's really what it was or not. But I mean, can you imagine Tony Blair and Alistair Campbell allowing that and just sort of saying, oh, yeah, well, that's fine. Anyway, you give me your take. You worked for the BBC for decades, or a long time.
Yeah, I was there for 10 years. So there are all news media organisations make mistakes. The BBC, until you work at the BBC, it's actually a bit smaller than it was when I was there, but until you work at the BBC, you have no real appreciation of just quite how huge it is, right? It's not, it's almost like an industry in itself rather than, just an individual news organisation. I mean, so many different platforms, whether it's television, whether it's radio, whether it's online, and as I say, I think one of the reasons I would argue it probably makes more mistakes than it used to when I was there, although it's always made mistakes, as we do, right?
Yeah.
Money has been squeezed. I was reminiscing that when I joined the BBC in 2006, was it the end of 2005, beginning of 2006, I had to go on a 2-week... I've been a journalist for more than 20 years, a print journalist, but anybody who joined the BBC at any level had to go on a 2-week induction course, right? And it's a residential thing, right? And it drove me up the wall because I did feel at the time there's literally nothing there telling me that I didn't already know. But they took this idea of, what impartial news is, how you make judgments incredibly seriously, right? Now, they just haven't got the resource. I was talking to somebody the other day. I think there's almost no training at all now. So I think part of the problem is, they're taking in a load of young people at all levels, and I think there are a number of problems that they face, which is, one, how much training actually is there. Two, to use a rather fashionable expression, these days there is so much what you might call contested space of a sort that there just wasn't when I joined the BBC 20 years ago. So let's take an issue like trans and gender. There are just quite a lot of people who just think that their point of view on trans is just simply true, and that there is not an argument to be had, and that the idea of impartiality for them,
it's right or wrong.
It's just right or wrong, and that just makes for any impartial broadcaster, right? Particularly with areas, whether it's trans or whether it's Gaza, there are people who no longer are prepared to accept that somebody else's point of view is legitimate, right? And therefore it is just really hard to make sure that the language and the presentation on certain issues is genuinely impartial. When you have people within your own organisation who have utterly different views about what the truth is. So that's part of it. But my fundamental view about what's gone on the BBC is it has just made too many mistakes recently. Mm-hmm. I think that it is the reason I know that it's not institutionally biased, which is the charge that Reform and the Tories make against it, is because on any given day you can find the BBC expressing one view, for example, on Gaza, and then somewhere else a completely different view. And that is not consistent with institutional bias. What it is consistent with is pretty poor management, too many mistakes being made, not enough sense of who they really are, not enough confidence. So, there is...
I think the problem with the BBC these days is blandness, not bias. It doesn't, half the time it doesn't say anything because it's too terrified of everything.
I mean, we've talked about this before. One of the things that I did criticise the BBC, and I have done on a number of occasions, that in many cases, they seem to me to have not understood that impartiality does require you to take a view on the basis of evidence. And, too often the BBC is on the one hand this, on the other hand that, without adjudicating which view is more likely to be true. And that was certainly true in the case of the Brexit debate.
I know we've had this discussion before, and I've said these things before, but I think within the basis of this discussion, they merit repeating, which is that, because I think it's something that people who have never worked in the broadcasting industry, even journalists, don't really understand that. I've worked in this company, in the broadcasting industry, for 35 years. I've worked with hundreds, if not by now, many thousands of people closely. What I can say for absolute certain is that for almost everyone I encountered and worked with, impartiality is like a quasi-religion. I want to make one other tiny point about the edit, though, because we should be clear that the Trump edit in that documentary was a mistake, because it took two bits of SOT, edited them together, and gave a sort of misleading impression of what he had been trying to say.
So I hadn't realised until I saw the edit, because often, if you're doing a news report, you will put together...
Of course, that was the point I was going to make.
We've done that. And then there'll be a big flash in the middle, so people can see that there's a...
Mostly there is, but not always. Tens of thousands of times in the course of my career here, you're editing the leader's speech on conference day. The leader's speech is an hour long. You've got 3 minutes 15 for the evening news, and you put together this bit of speech and this bit of speech. The question is, does it alter the sense of that passage of the speech? And that's where this fell down, and that's why there should have been it should have been clear that there was an edit between the two.
Oh yeah, it was shocking. I have to say, when I saw it, I didn't think I was going to be shocked. I was genuinely shocked by what they did.
Okay, you worked in the BBC. What happens next as regard the board? Does Robbie Gibbs survive? Does the chair survive? And what do they do about this lawsuit if it goes ahead?
So I was told, actually, trying to think what it was now, a couple of nights ago, that they'd had legal advice on the Trump threat to sue for $1 billion. Their general counsel had told them that they didn't think that they had damaged Trump in a way that would require the BBC to pay him any money whatsoever. And therefore, just to be clear, even if the BBC felt minded to pay him a small amount of money to go away, I don't think they can. Because if they've got legal advice from their own general counsel, they shouldn't do that, right? I think there would be absolute uproar among licence fee payers if their money was paid to Donald Trump. So I think they do have to absolutely tough it out. It'll be painful. It'll be embarrassing, frankly, for the government because, let's be clear, Keir Starmer wants to be a friend of Donald Trump. But I don't think they've got an option. I don't think one should underestimate the scale of the crisis. Because of the nature of the mistakes that the BBC had made, I do understand why Deborah Turness felt she had to resign. I'm absolutely clear that the Director General, Tim Davie, did not have to resign. He could have, I think, he could have continued. My understanding is he wanted to stay for initially he'd wanted to stay for another year, 18 months. I think he could have done that, but he just decided he was exhausted and had enough, which is why he decided to go, although, he'll be there for a little period till there's a handover. They will struggle. I mean, I've spoken to lots of the people who are, on the sort of shortlist, the board's shortlist, as possible replacements. And the consistent theme, talking to those people, is why would I want this grief in my life? Because the thing about being Director General of the BBC is, you're in the public eye all the time. You're bombarded with criticism and, in some cases, hate by politicians, from the media. It's literally, 16 hours a day. It's exhausting. Now, I would argue it's also an incredibly important job. We need a strong, impartial BBC. It's important to the country. It's actually important to ITV that we're not, essentially on our own as an impartial news provider. So it really matters that the BBC gets its mojo back, gets its strength back. If you're remotely interested, I think the one person who I can't work out whether she's likely to want to do it or not, who I know the BBC are thinking about, is their former head of content, a woman called Charlotte Moore. And I don't know whether she felt a bit, I think, bruised. She was in the frame when Tim Davie got it, but I think she sort of felt that she was encouraged to stand as the token woman. I think felt a bit, to make the BBC look better, that it wasn't. But so I think she feels. But I don't know whether she'll feel that it's her sort of national duty to go back and save the BBC, because she's got a big job on the outside now. But apart from that, I've gone through most of the others, and I don't think they're going to find it that easy to replace him.
We need to wrap it there. It's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.